Gunfire Games recently released the third and final DLC for Remnant 2, and with that came a brand new game mode which I'm sure you're familiar with at this point. Boss Rush has garnered plenty of positive reception within the community, allowing players to jump right into the action with almost every boss in the game in any given run. This game mode also leans even more into roguelike elements, which is what I refer to as gamer cred. There's plenty to be excited about, but I also think that Gunfire left a whole lot on the table, and the potential of this game mode has not been reached. In this video, I want to talk about my thoughts surrounding Boss Rush, positive and negative. I want to share what I think could vastly improve this game mode, increasing gamer retention and overall enjoyment of a somewhat underbaked mode that left many disappointed and wanting more. Now, as a disclaimer, Remnant 2 is in a league of its own, and I've never played anything like it. From enemies to gunplay, sound, visuals, limitless secrets to uncover. Shit, I wouldn't have 1,000 hours if I didn't feel this way. It's a phenomenal game that deserves way more eyes on it, but as a veteran of Remnant who has exhausted pretty much everything on offer since the release date, here's what I think could bring people back into the game and keep them there for the foreseeable future. Let's start with the most baffling, head-scratching decision upon the release of Boss Rush. In the early days between the second and third DLC, Ben Curitan, principal designer of Remnant 2, teased us with information drips starting around and on September 13th. One of the first things he said was, you can use your existing character, you can also start a new character and go right into Boss Rush. One of the greatest appeals of Remnant 2 in my opinion is starting a fresh hardcore character and being forced to beat the game using what it gives you along your journey to annihilation. I was somewhat shocked when it was announced that Boss Rush could be done with any predetermined build, and I say this because one of the biggest pulls in any roguelike game mode, including Remnant 1 survival mode, was that you started from scratch and had to use what the game gave or offered you. Instead of the excitement of, ooh man, I guess I have to try this weapon out, or man, I've never used this armor set before, I guess we'll see how well it works, players are just going to stick with what they're comfortable with. And it ends up being like this because, although the game grants you complete freedom before entering this sandbox, the freedom shoots itself in the foot by completely removing the surprise in-the-moment build crafting that Remnant thrives on. Perhaps my first impressions were soured in anticipation of the game mode, so when it was said that you could also start a new character and go right into Boss Rush, I stayed strong in hopes that this would offer an incredible roguelike experience for new characters, especially since it was stated that you could get all sorts of rings, amulets, and weapons from the game mode if you haven't already unlocked them. Upon reading further, one very damning outcome stuck out like a sore thumb. Rewards were granted after the completion of a run. That means you can play an entire gauntlet of 19 bosses and not get a single item until the very end. You could pick up scrap, metal, consumables, and throwables, sure, but no equipable items whatsoever. Another important note is that you only receive gear and weapons per world boss defeated. So that means, instead of receiving a mod per side boss and a weapon per world boss, you only receive one random ring, amulet, or weapon every 3 bosses. For existing characters, this doesn't really matter, but from the perspective of those hoping to have any sort of build crafting experience along the journey, it matters a whole lot. To me, it feels like a ginormous missed opportunity, especially since they did it so well with Remnant from the Ashes survival mode. So just to make sure, I tested out what it was like to start completely from scratch, going through a 3-boss triple threat, a 7-boss trial by fire, and a 19-boss gauntlet. When I play hardcore, I always do it on Apocalypse, so I did the same here for Boss Rush. Here are my results. After completing the trial by fire, I was awarded with my first prism, which I was excited to start leveling up. In terms of equipment, as promised, I was given a single item, an amulet. The first glaring issue stood out immediately. I wasn't granted a single trait point. No trait points? Oh no. But you don't get trait points from Boss Rush? Fuck me. This would be the case for the entirety of my experience. Boss Rush does not grant any trait points whatsoever at any point. Typically, taking a 30 to 45 minute run through Yaesha while defeating 2 bosses and avoiding side paths would grant you these rewards. Let's say you went to Forbidden Grove, Nameless Nest, the Far Woods, and Twisted Chantry. So in totality, you'd get 2 mods, 4 floor drops, and 4 trait points. In comparison, a triple threat run granted 1 amulet and no trait points, or boss mods. In terms of pickups, running through the maps granted me an abundance of scrap and iron, so I was able to level up my weapons appropriately. With the triple threat, I wasn't granted any iron whatsoever. You get iron either? This is not good. And the pickups that I did get included corrupted luminite, corrupted shards, and some throwables. The scrap amounts were about the same for time spent after I sold everything, but I wasn't able to improve my weapons or loadout whatsoever. I hoped it would be better after the trial by fire. As promised, I was rewarded 2 items for the 2 world bosses defeated, although I feel like maybe Annihilation should also count as a world boss, but it doesn't here. I was rewarded a ring and a melee weapon from Nightweaver, whom I didn't even fight. Why did I get Nightshade? I didn't even This post made me believe I would be granted potential rewards from the bosses I did fight, those being OTK and Lydusa, but this was not the case. That was definitely odd to me, but the most damning thing was receiving absolutely no iron, again, continuing to leave my weapons at a base level. I was basically entering the 19 boss gauntlet with base level guns and no gear, so I purchased some rings from Reggie and continued forth on my adventure. I completed the 19 boss gauntlet, and let me tell you, my disappointment was beyond measurable, and my day was ruined. I was granted 5 total items when in reality I should have gotten 6, and one of those items was an item that Reggie was selling, not even Cass. I got Ring of Phantom Pain. It's literally in Reggie's shop. I've received 2 melee weapons and 2 amulets along with this. My other pickups were a shit ton of corrupted luminites and relic dust, but again, no actual materials to upgrade my weapons. It is evident that Boss Rush was not designed in mind for fresh characters. Not even close. After nearly 6 hours of grinding, I had next to nothing to show for it aside from scrap. I was rewarded no upgrade materials for any of my weapons, not including corrupted weapons, because of course I don't have those. I received 2 entire luminites across 29 bosses, so I wasn't even halfway ready to purchase a second archetype. The rewards for playing Boss Rush over and over do not actually offer up any character progression aside from experience points for my archetype and prism. In comparison, Remnant 1's survival mode not only gave you an incredible roguelike experience where every run felt different and more exciting from the last, almost feeling like a completely different game, but it granted you account-bound rings and amulets, along with a piece of armor and a weapon that you could not get anywhere else. You could also accrue glowing fragments, which allowed you to purchase armor skins, another feature that just never made it into Remnant 2. The game mode was a separate, beautiful experience that also rewarded your main account, which is a lot different than Boss Rush's current situation. As a player who already had everything in the game on my main character, there was never any progression to be felt. The only thing you can unlock that is new in this game mode are more blank prisms to level up. Endgame characters do not need prisms with how many powerful builds exist in-game, so it ends up being a game mode where you experience more of the same thing that you've already experienced. Don't get me wrong, it's a blast to live out your power fantasies when you get something like double mod charges for your legendary effect, but it gets old pressing F, shooting at a boss, and having it disappear right before your eyes over and over and over again. It feels less like endgame content and more like, how many ways can I break the game until I get bored? Considering Remnant's strengths lie with all of its incredible progression systems working in tandem, it is baffling how many of those systems feel completely thrown to the wayside without a second thought. Back to my point. How could Gunfire improve this situation? The reward system could use some work. If they allowed experience to be rewarded as you play, the progression would be a lot more enjoyable. Usually, you level up one by one, learning more about your class as you slowly increase in power. Instead, you're slapped with 20 different fucking UI pop-ups upon returning to Ward 13, and boom, you just played as a level 0 the entire time, and now you're level 10 in the blink of an eye. It is extremely unbalanced. Trait points need to be implemented here in some way like they are in the base game. Maybe not floor pickups, but perhaps a trait point per boss defeated. Trait points are a vital progression system to keep players hooked, and continue to have their dopamine receptors fire off, and if items can be rewarded from this mode, I don't see why trait points can't be. I don't know if it's bugged or not, but not receiving any upgrade materials for regular and special weapons was such a bummer. I don't understand it, and I hope this can be fixed and or implemented. Rings, amulets, and weapons are handed out once every 3 bosses, completely at random, and only when you return to the ward. This suffers from the same issue as experience, where it slaps you in the face all at once, and adds absolutely nothing to builds for the time invested, at least in my experience. To reiterate, I received 3 amulets, 2 rings, 3 melee weapons, and no guns for the 29 bosses defeated, along with all the mobs and aberrations along the way. I feel that they could be more generous with newer accounts in regards to the amount of gear you're getting. I also feel like there has to be a way to allow them to drop during the boss rush itself. Although the modding scene is niche for Remnant 2, one of the first mods to drop after DLC 3 release was Survival Boss Rush, which enables build making on the fly, granting things such as trait points, trinkets, armors, relics, etc. People are seeing the potential of what this game mode could be. If Gunfire made it more friendly towards new save files and made progression feel more, for lack of a better term, Remnant-y, then they'd immediately hook so many more people into the incredible game loop that I know that they're capable of putting out. Moving on to my next topic of conversation, let's take a look at power pylons. Power pylons are the core to the roguelike experience of Boss Rush. Essentially, you will find a power pylon in every single arena prior to entering the boss's domain. Upon interacting with one, you are offered 3 different upgrade choices from a total of 28, which can either be base stat upgrades or what Gunfire refers to as hacks. Let's start with hacks, and how people often end up avoiding them entirely in favor of base stat upgrades through any given run. So, hacks are referred to as more complex buffs. The only problem is, man, these things fucking suck. Some aren't that bad, sure, like Vortex is kinda cool, but when I hear the word hack, I expect to live out some sort of power fantasy akin to even a fraction of the cool shit you can enter the game mode with. Not this. What is this? Let's dive into all 9 of these real quick. The first one shown is Detonate, where taking damage builds up an AoE that will eventually explode if you take damage. Again, at the max level of 5, taking damage a couple times will have it repeatedly go off, but levels 1 through 4 take an absurd amount of self-damage to do anything. In the reward? Well, with all my gear stacked towards explosive damage and none towards range damage, my Chicago typewriter manages to deal more damage with, like, 2 bullets. What are we even talking about? Explosive is the saddest hack, where when you kill a mob, they explode, damaging other mobs. But if you're already dealing AoE damage, everything is already dead. It's not like enemy density is ramped up here for Boss Rush. You're essentially just running through a snippet of a random level you've already been to in Remnant 2, and there's only a handful of enemies at a time. If explosive operated like the detonator mutator, where X amount of bullets triggered an explosion, then maybe it could be considered, but at this point, it is complete trash, and useless against the main component of boss rush. The bosses. Healing orbs drop orbs that heal. It's useless against bosses since it's an on-kill effect, and the orbs heal this much. Wouldn't really consider this a hack. Hexer is one of the most oppressive modifiers that an aberration can have, where every X amount of seconds, they summon a shit ton of elemental orbs, and these orbs can afflict you with everything from corroded, shock, burn, etc. I was hyped to be able to have Hexer myself in boss rush, but to my dismay, it's just a completely neutered version that only procs upon taking enemy damage. Every level allows you to spawn an extra projectile up to 5, but they don't afflict enemies with status effects, they just deal contact damage. It's just okay. Then there's Spinner, which made me feel like I could run around Binding of Isaac style, slapping cheeks with orbitals. Until I ran up to an enemy and realized that they just disappear on contact. Alright, so how much damage does the orb do? 180? And it disappears after contact. Nonsense. They come back fairly quickly and stagger enemies kind of easily, but it's just another who the fuck cares effect. The staves hack. Brother, you thought you were gonna get Venom's cool staves and kick ass with them, didn't you? Alright, Root Staff, show me what you got! And then what does that do? It misses, that's what it fucking does. And of course, it's another on-kill effect. If Trapper did more damage, it could be pretty competitive, but it's otherwise just a fine upgrade, where dealing damage makes little Trapper circles that deal damage over time to the enemy. Vortex used to affect bosses, but if I recall correctly, that was patched out, so now Vortex sucks in regular mobs and elites, keeping them away from you and making them easier to hit. This one's kinda fun to use. And then the most fun of them all by a fucking 1,000 miles! We have Shocking, where depending on level, releases 1 to 5 lightning strikes upon hitting an enemy with a charged melee attack. This can get utterly ridiculous depending on what weapons you use, and they even buffed it recently to deal AoE damage. Finally, a hack that feels like a hack. That begs the question. Why? Why do most of the hacks feel so ineffective in comparison to your actual arsenal? It feels so poorly implemented and unbalanced when you have all these other batshit effects that you can just enter the game mode with, rendering most hacks completely useless when you're already blasting shit to pieces. Hacks just become dead choices whenever you touch a pylon when you have other very clear, stronger choices you'd be trying to aim for. 50% range damage or crit damage will always trump an on-kill effect or an on-taking enemy damage effect, unless those effects were insanely interesting and effective, which they just aren't. I have played an unreasonable amount of roguelikes in my decades of gaming, and when you are presented with 3 choices when it comes time to upgrade, all 3 of those choices are supposed to be tantalizing to an extent. When you have 9 upgrade choices out of a possible 28 that are touted to be hacks, and most of them are shit for the majority of builds, that doesn't make for compelling progression. Let me make some suggestions that I think would be more interesting and fun to interact with our current hacks available in the game, and also some hacks that don't currently exist but could. Whatever happens with staffs, remove its ability to friendly fire. I think I picked it once, and I also think it hit me multiple times throughout that run. I don't recall it doing anything to the enemies. Maybe just get rid of this one entirely. Take spinning orbs and make them permanent so players can have a damaging aura around them, increasing the risk and reward of getting close to enemies. As mentioned earlier, take the explosion hack and apply it to X amount of magazine spent instead, so it can see play against bosses and be overall more effective, interesting, and fun to engage with. Double the output of Hexer. If the game can handle an aberration spamming you with 30 million projectiles, it can probably handle you spamming the enemy right back. Also, make them apply elemental DOTs, just like Hexer does for the enemies. Increase the damage of Detonate and rework it to send out shockwaves in the same vein as gaining stacks of Rampage. Dealing X damage grants a stack for Rampage, but instead of Rampage stacks, dealing X damage sends out a shockwave. That could be cool. I think it's in a close to decent state right now, but it still is just not great. Healing orbs is a bit redundant with all the sources of healing in the game, and since it isn't even comparable to something like Renewal, either juice it up or just remove it. In my opinion, it's inflating the current pool of buffs. Now, let me share some of my ideas I have for new hacks. I feel like these ideas lean into the wackiness that Remnant has always leaned into, while keeping the spirit of the roguelike boss rush in mind. Do note that the percentages I show here may not be balanced, but I did my best. We have Deceitful, which gives a 5 to 25% chance to spawn an Invader clone on dodge. Maybe you can even do it for perfect dodge. It takes the power of Invader's Prime perk or Relic perk and allows the player to incorporate it into any build. Then there's Wealthy, where every 10 to 30 seconds, a random fountain will spawn under the player that stays on the ground for 10 seconds. These fountains are out of the pool of Explorer's Gold Digger perk, and Explorer's probably the least used class currently. It's random, it's effective, and it's fun. Next up is something I've been shouting from the rooftops for nearly a year, but Jesus, why can't we clone ourselves yet? It's the funniest thing in the world to watch as a clone of yourself chases you around, trying to kick the shit out of you. It's just so fucking dumb. I can't see a better way to implement it, so I present to you Duplicate. Taking X amount of damage summons a clone for the player. The clone can aggro enemies quite like an invader clone or a handler's dog, and levels increase its health, damage reduction, and damage. This takes the idea of taking enemy damage to deal damage, and just makes it more engaging for the player as opposed to just dealing a meager amount of damage sometimes. Plus, it'd be fucking hilarious. Gambler is an interesting idea for a hack, and it would grant the player a random base buff that is 1.5 times more powerful than usual. Every time you load up a new area, the buff would change into another random base buff. For instance, at level 1, if it rolled range damage, it would grant 15% instead of 10%. At level 5, if it rolled health, it would grant 75 instead of 50. If I left an area with level 5 Gambler, I could lose 150% reload speed, and in return, gain 37.5% DR. You might lose a really nice boon and have it changed into something like melee damage upon entering an arena with Lydusa. That's just how the dice roll, I guess. Okay. Fueled would give you a 20 to 100% chance to not consume a consumable/throwable. This would allow players who don't have extreme wealth to tap into a different part of the game through some of the more interesting consumables like Ambit Ember and Rocket Fuel, or have fun cosplaying as Gwendol with pipe bombs, tar grenades, etc. It's similar to Addicted, which would increase concoction limits by 1 to 5, and make it so concoctions aren't consumed while in boss rush. You can have up to 12 concoctions with the right gear in Prism currently, so having it as a boss rush effect would make it more achievable for most players. And then finally, we have Essence of Kaeula, where every X seconds, a Kaeula-sized tentacle will emerge and slap the shit out of an enemy. Kind of like Root Lash, but does it automatically, and I'm not talking those little bitch tentacles, I'm talking the big tentacles that Kaeula spawns. With the current state of Remnant 2, the last thing we need is more upgrades that turn us into a god, because there are just so many builds that can make Apocalypse look like baby mode. These ideas don't turn you into a god or break the game. They're just fun, they're silly, and can make fighting enemies feel completely different and rewarding. Remnant has always been so fucking good at making the player feel empowered in hundreds of ways, where beating the shit out of a Dran or popping its head never gets old. Trust me, I don't typically make top meta builds on this channel. I just find the fun, goofy shit, find a way to make it Apocalypse friendly, and I kill that Dran again. But without any sort of new character experience, and without compelling progression choices or meaningful upgrades within the new game mode, it's just more of the same. It's just a more streamlined version of the game we've been playing, and that feels like a ginormous missed opportunity. The only one I thought of in the name hack was the Shocking hack, but I can promise you that not many players typically enter boss rush with a melee-centric build. This is probably because it's a third-person shooter and most bosses are out of melee range. If they have the proper melee weapon to switch to, like Harvester Scythe or Dark Matter Gauntlets, this hack is great, and then they would probably want to start focusing solely on a charged melee build. There's a certain few pylons one might want to strive for in a melee build, which transitions us nicely into the next problem with boss rush. Because we have the freedom of creating our build prior to entering boss rush, we typically have an idea of what 5 upgrades we want to see to get the most out of our build. For instance, when I put together the Fire Rate Bulldog build, I knew flat out I'd probably want Fire Rate. I also wanted crit damage, weak spot damage, range damage, and then something like damage reduction or health to round out the build. Only one of these upgrades was completely vital to enjoying the insanity of the idea, and the rest were to simply improve DPS and round out any weaker portions of the build. With a 3 and 7 boss rush, you can't get anywhere near the max amount of pylon upgrades, which is 25, since you get 1 per mob area and 1 per boss. I always run the 19 boss gauntlet so I can achieve maximum power. If I'm missing a particular upgrade that I want, I can only skip 11 pylon upgrades before I start missing out on total power, as each upgrade grants you a 5% flat all damage bonus, regardless of what you choose as an upgrade. This is totally and utterly up to RNG, and the game may decide that you will not get anything you want ever. Take for instance this run, where I skipped so many times, and in quite literally every single offer, I was offered renewal, bricking my options completely. Hey, remember when you skipped health regen? Did you want some... Did you want some more health regen with that? Please! Stop! I'm gonna punch my monitor. Renewal! Fuck all the way off to a different fucking continent! I don't give a shit which one! Renewal? Go away! Please! It's renewal again. It is bad luck and it doesn't happen often, but if you're looking for 5 to 8 different upgrades out of the total of 28, you may never see a single one throughout the entire run. This has an adverse effect on the idea of boss rush because that type of RNG does not mesh well with a player's plan for their build. There are ways to fix this issue and have it fit better. I can name tons of roguelikes that offer these sorts of systems, and an easy one to look at is Hades. Hades has meta progression outside of the game, and you can earn dice to use in your runs. These dice allow you to reroll boons, and this would translate pretty well into Remnant's boss rush. Don't like your 3 choices? Use the dice to reroll them. There's also roguelikes that allow you to ban an upgrade, which shrinks the pool of choices if you really don't want to see that particular option in the future. I'm not saying that we need meta progression to flesh out boss rush, although that'd be pretty fucking sick, but having the ability to curate a run would make more sense and offer a more enjoyable experience, especially since boss rush is kind of centric around you planning your build prior to entering. There's one more section I'd like to touch up on. This one may be a bit of a stretch considering that Gunfire is most likely ready to move on from Remnant 2, but here goes nothing. Boss Rush was advertised as a combination of Horde, Survival, and Boss Rush. They've got the Boss Rush part down because, you gotta rush to the bosses. As we've talked about in our first few points, the survival aspects are anemic at best, other than the fact that you probably shouldn't die. The Horde aspects aren't very, well, Horde-y either. But let's touch up on dungeon seeds first. There are a handful of seeds a player can arrive at prior to entering a boss fight, allowing for a decent amount of variety when it comes to enemy spawns. In the end, if you land in an area connected by giant roots, you know you're going to go up against the root flyers. If you end up in a sewer, you know you're going to see the slimes that lead to Bloat King. Using this logic, many people wonder why there are 0 root earth seeds. They also wonder why we don't see cancer or venom. I wonder the same. I see it as yet another giant missed opportunity, omitting 2 of the endgame bosses and all of the endgame mobs for seemingly no reason. They could absolutely use the first siege event from Root Earth to lead into Cancer, and the second siege event to lead into Venom. These seeds we see for each boss and boss rush are already in the game, and they'll go as far as to block certain areas off of the giant immersion-breaking impassable wall, so I find it extremely disappointing that they didn't make that kind of exception for one of the most beloved biomes that we seldom see. Ah, beautiful door! Fit for a true champion. As a side note, I feel this way about the Labyrinth too, but I also understand why people would not want to fight the Labyrinth Sentinel regularly. It is a shame, however, that we aren't faced with any of the Labyrinth enemies. 7 and 19 boss rush allows us to fight Annihilation, which is great for players that don't want to run through the entire campaign to be part of one of the greatest boss fights of all time. I also consider the rest of Root Earth to be one of the greater experiences in Remnant 2. Gunfire should seriously consider slapping them in to create more variety. Root Earth mobbing areas would not only add variety into the gameplay loop, but also offer much more of a challenge because the Horde aspects in boss rush are severely lacking right now. Enemy density in these predetermined seeds are no different than running through a regular area in campaign or adventure. At the middle point of boss rush, and with a decent enough build at the very beginning, the enemies pose little to no threat. If a player decides to go into boss rush with any sort of AoE, slow, etc., it's pretty much over. That is, unless the aberration spawns out of nowhere and pulls some one-hit shocker fucking bullshit. The bosses feel like they scale well level to level, but the mobs just get run over without a care or a thought. This doesn't apply to, say, the pots and glitter and grotto, but everything else doesn't stand a chance. Apocalypse saying good luck for its description is more fitting to say to the enemies with nearly every loadout combination. So, how can the Horde section be improved to feel more engaging? From a basic standpoint, they could just increase the health, damage, and density of the trash mobs to at least give them a fighting chance, but I don't see that as much of an improvement. Maybe inspiration from other games could help here. A good example of this lies within the ARPG genre. Games like Path of Exile try their best to counteract the potential godly builds that players run. Considering players can easily take incredibly overpowered builds into battle, along with upgrades from power pylons, Remnant could apply modifiers to regular enemies to improve overall balance and engagement in boss rush. Let's imagine a world where this is possible. With several ways to indicate these modifiers, such as icons below health bars, auras under the enemy, etc., how well would this work? Let's have some fun with it. Maybe not modifiers directly from aberrations and bosses like, being more resistant to physical or elemental damage, equivalent to thick skin and elemental resist. Maybe they could increase in size, increasing their health and defense while simultaneously slowing them down. They could become enraged if a friendly is killed by you, increasing their attack speed and aggressiveness. Certain enemies could be extremely resistant to damage while tethered to another mob who is unaffected by the buff, forcing you to reposition and make decisions on who to kill first. Perhaps even better, what if the player was either given a curse at the beginning of every mob level, or given a choice of 3 that they had to choose from that would empower enemies or debuff the player? It's kinda like Lydusa's curse, but with tons of other options. Here's some ideas for that. Actions that require stamina consume twice the amount, while disabling unlimited stamina synergies. Enemies drop a damage puddle, or explode upon death. Enemies are immune to slow effects. Enemy actions occur 25% faster. There could be a higher chance to replace regular mobs with elites, or mobs having a higher chance to turn into elites, kinda like how the Dran turn into frogs and the Stone Boy turns into Stone Elite. Skills or mods are disabled for the arena. Enemy attacks inflict a random status effect. Enemies are tethered with a damage-dealing beam if you run into it. Your magazine size is decreased by 50%. Your AoE effects are reduced by 90%. All enemies have a shield. Mobs from all biomes can spawn, so if you're in Yaesha, you could see a Dran. They can even disable certain equipment. I'm just throwing fun ideas out there, because right now, with most builds, it's pretty easy to run straight through every single trash mob, even on the highest difficulty. This video was released early for my members, and they had a few things to say, but first, I just wanted to thank them. I also wanted to thank everybody else for the support. It's been a hell of a year. Bubble Gaming brought up some of the game-breaking bugs that can occur during these runs, such as bosses being thrown out of the world and the crashing. Primogenitor especially loves finding a way to brick runs by completely disappearing, and even foolproof plans like AoEing and random locations to deal damage to him doesn't work every time. I've also crashed quite a few times, and although it's been improved, it isn't gone for everyone. It feels really shitty to lose a run to a crash. In fact, I got my buddies that helped me start the channel back into the game, and at the end of 2 boss rushes, either one of them crashed at the end. They haven't played since. It sucks. Fred brought up the idea of an endless mode, which I'm sure we can all get on board with that. At the end of the gauntlet, you could choose to end the run or continue. I love it. Oh, and one last thing. Why the fuck are these vaultable? Well, that's the end of the stream, everyone. Been a pleasure. Really fun time. Yeah.